There we go. Hello, everybody. Coming into this hub session on asbestos for surveyors. You will be all on mute, and you'll be able to turn your camera on because we're recording this. So I'll be really grateful if you could, in the chat, if you know where that is on the bottom, that you could say hello, tell me that you can hear us okay. Tell us a bit about you as a surveyor, where do you live, what did you have for your tea? There we go. Hi, Stefan. There you go. Hi, John. Glad you got you in there. Cool. So tell me a bit more about who you are and where you are. There's loads of you on this one. I'll just take a minute to add on. Super. Good stuff. Right, so I am going to be hovering in the background on this session. So I know nothing. Well, no, that's not right. I do know a bit about asbestos. I was going to say, I know nothing worth sharing. I do, but I'm not the expert here. So I'm going to monitor the little chat box. We're going to do questions at the end. So if you do have a question, just so we can see when we come to filter it. The presentation is about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. But when you write the question in, if you can put the letter Q, kind of Q, please, it'll help me identify them a bit easier. And we'll group them and try and do them all at the end, and I'll read them out, and we'll get Callum to ask what he can. Also, do continue the conversation in the Surveyor Hub Facebook group if you're there. Don't forget to leave us a review on Google and the podcast if you haven't heard today's podcast with Ian Bullock. That was quite a good one. We put these webinars on free. They're by members, for members. They're not meant to be polished. It's just a bit of a friendly share. We're not all experts at presenting, and I'm known to cut people off. Not to worry you, Callum. I've learned my lesson now. But things like a review, sharing the podcast, just saying thanks, it just makes a massive difference. So do that. Okay, so got some messages here. A lot of Starver students in, which are great. I'd love to know, are many of you going to the Sarva Careers Fair next week on the 29th of March? I will be there, so it'll be nice to say hello. So I'm not stood all by myself. Because I said, could we have a little corner where we could just have a bit of a Surveyor Hub huddle and meet up, and they give me a table. So now I've got to do a banner. I've got a little desk, and now I've got to act all professional. So okay, I'm going to hand over to Callum. I'll monitor the chat, and I will see you all in a bit. Thanks a lot, Callum.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Marion. Perfect. I hope you've all had a lovely weekend, and that all the mothers have been spoilt silly, as they well deserve. So yeah, I'm Callum. I'm a senior asbestos surveyor and analyst, and I work for a company called CASA Environmental Services. We operate in the southwest and south of England. So if you have any asbestos surveying, air testing, asbestos removals needs, do feel free to get in touch with myself. All of my contact details will be on the very last slide of this presentation. So hopefully that will save you a question in the short term. So today we are mainly focusing on asbestos textured coatings, but I will be going through just a brief asbestos awareness, just to kind of bring up to speed some people who might never have encountered it at all. Hopefully you will have a vague understanding of what it is at this point, but as Marion said, she's not an expert. By far, I would not describe myself as an expert. I know a bit. But I do like telling people about the stuff that I know. So yeah, like I say, this won't be as in detail or as in depth as a full asbestos awareness training course would be. But like Marion said, this is kind of just sort of, well, we're skimming the surface today. So we'll talk about textured coatings and what they are and how asbestos is relevant to them. I'll go into the testing of the material, how it should be tested, how it is tested, and then we'll talk about management, ongoing management of the material and removal as well if that's required. So that will be some advice that you might be able to give to your clients if required. And then finally we'll finish off with just a little bit of further reading for yourselves to fill the rest of your evening, because hopefully we'll only be here till 6ish. So starting off, asbestos awareness, like I say, in brief. So there's 6 regulated fibre types in the UK. You'll hear the colours of asbestos referred to quite a lot. They do loosely relate to the actual colour of the asbestos fibre itself, but they have absolutely nothing to do with the colour of the material that asbestos tends to be present within. So you'll quite often hear people, I get clients that tell me, oh, apparently I've got white asbestos in my ceilings. What does that mean? Usually I require a little bit more information than just the fibre type, because the actual material that it's bound within is arguably the most important. The general consensus is that blue, chrysidolite and amosite brown are the most harmful, and that exposure to those is much more likely to lead to asbestos-related diseases. And there is a bit of an urban myth that chrysotile is not bad for you at all. Couldn't be further from the truth. There is, there's undeniable evidence and studies that prove that that is also carcinogenic as well. So I would, by far and above, suggest that you avoid exposure to all of them in equality, frankly. We have the 3 rare fibre types as well. We refer to them as rare in the industry, and that's just because they weren't commercially mined in the same way that the other fibre types were. Asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral mined from the ground. I didn't know that before I started doing this for a job. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. I think my Zoom might have frozen.
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
Yeah, perfect. That's fine. So it's just my video. That's all right. That's fine. You should look at me anyway. So yeah, the rare fibre types, not commercially mined, but they do occasionally turn up in asbestos materials, usually as a contaminant of one of the other extracted fibre types, although occasionally they were purposefully added. So asbestos has useful properties. That was why it was added to materials. You'll often hear it referred to as a miracle material. It's great for acoustic insulation, thermal and electrical insulation. It has generally very high chemical resistance, and it was also added to materials to strengthen or bind them together. We tend to sort of subcategorize asbestos-containing materials, or ACMs is the common acronym. We tend to categorize them into sort of some of the following products. So asbestos cement products, which I would say are one of the most common materials in the UK. You're thinking about your profiled sheet roofs to garages, a lot of farm buildings made almost entirely of asbestos cement products. Very, very common in the home as well, and I'll show you a few locations where you're likely to find those on the next slide as well. Decorative texture coatings, which we'll be covering today. Asbestos insulating board, which is a lower density board usually used for acoustic or fireproofing reasons. And thermal and sprayed insulation, generally considered to be the highest risk asbestos material. Thankfully, very rare in domestic properties, especially your sort of, typical 3-bedroom semi-detached. It's a lot more common in some of the larger residences, so big countryside manors and buildings that may have had very early central heating systems. You'll also get woven textiles, so yarns and ropes and fabric as well, cloth, and then your vinyl floor tiles and your thermoplastic floor tiles, bitumen products as well, other plastics and resins as well, like Bakelite materials. As we should all know by now, if not, this is the most important thing. It's incredibly hazardous to health. It's a known carcinogen. It leads to asbestosis, mesothelioma, and lung cancer, all 3 of which are most often than not, especially in the case of mesothelioma, almost always fatal, unfortunately. Pleural plaques, not necessarily a cause of death, but are seriously debilitating later on in life, and will likely ultimately lead to other fatal consequences. So it's like I say, something that should actively be avoided. It's also one of the most easily avoidable carcinogens in the UK, because we have the ability to know about it, and therefore we have the ability to avoid exposure to it. However, in the UK, the statistics from the HSE are showing that still around 5,000 people every year are dying from, and that's just occupational exposure to asbestos materials. That is twice as many people that are unfortunately dying in road traffic accidents. So it's not a small quantity of people. I also read a study recently that estimated that the total deaths not necessarily attributable to occupational exposure may actually be in the tens of thousands of deaths every year as well. Just in the UK alone, it's hundreds of thousands of people across the world every year. So it's a serious business, and that's why we have people like me that do what we do. So there are two dates that we tend to refer to in terms of UK legislation, so prohibition of asbestos materials. The first one that we refer to is 1985, and in that year, the import and supply of both blue and brown asbestos fibres, crucidylite and amosite, was banned. So that also included the addition of those fibres to building materials or products. So generally speaking, you're unlikely to find, or it should be nigh on impossible to find, asbestos insulating boards or asbestos thermal lagging, pipe lagging, that.
And that is what we call losing Callum. So I'm going to press pause on the recording and see if we can, there we go.
Lovely, thank you. Right, sorry about that, everyone. So I'll try and skim through this quickly, because you may well have heard some of this already. So like I say, 6 regulated fibre types in the UK, white, blue and brown. The actual fibre type contained within the material is in UK legislation kind of irrelevant in terms of risk. We actually go by the product type, which are listed in the top right hand corner there. They determine the friability of the material and the risk of fibre release from that material in its sort of normal state, and also when it's damaged. So it's you'll quite often hear people say, I've got brown asbestos in my house, that must mean it's really bad. If it's brown asbestos, tied up within the matrix of a Bakelite toilet cistern, you've got a very, very low risk product on your hands there. If it's brown asbestos loose in the loft space, then obviously you'd be talking about a very different risk indeed. But like I say, it's hazardous to health. This should not massively be news to any of us. Like I say, there are common misconceptions about white asbestos chrysotile fibres, in that a lot of people believe that they're not bad for you at all. It's not true at all, unfortunately. It's irrefutably proven in scientific studies that white asbestos, although generally considered slightly less hazardous, is still a known carcinogen, and so, as far as I'm concerned, should be avoided at all costs. Chrysotile asbestos also makes up roughly around sort of 80-90% of all asbestos present in materials in buildings in the UK as well. So it's the one that you are far more likely to be exposed to on a day-to-day basis if this is your line of work. So it leads to asbestosis, mesothelioma and lung cancer, all 3 of which are unfortunately fatal the vast majority of the time. There are some known survivors. Mavis Nye is one. She was a survivor of mesothelioma. She's now a massive campaigner for the awareness of asbestos, and you'll see her very present on Facebook and LinkedIn. Pleural plaques are not necessarily fatal, but massively debilitating later on in life, and unfortunately are likely to lead to fatal consequences. So like I say, it's a material that exposure should be avoided at all costs, really. We've got the 2 main prohibition dates that we use. in the UK. So in 1985, generally the sort of higher risk licensable materials were banned. So that includes the import and supply of blue and brown asbestos fibres and the materials that contain them. That they were added to. It also applies to sprayed applications of asbestos and thermal insulation as well, and that also includes asbestos insulating boards. So generally speaking, that's the cut-off date that we use. That if you find a Superlux product, for example, like a mica board in a house built in 1991, theoretically, realistically, it shouldn't contain asbestos because it's an insulating board that was probably used or manufactured or installed after that cut-off date. Realistically, we actually tend to find very few asbestos-containing materials that conform to that category in the decade or so leading up to that prohibition, and that's because a lot of the manufacturers at the time implemented voluntary bans on adding asbestos materials. A lot of them had already started transferring to making non-asbestos materials, alternatives to the commonly used products. There is a reason for that. I won't get into it now, but if you wanted to ask that as a question in the chat, feel free, and I'll try and get back to that later on. And then our last prohibition date in the UK, 1999. So that applies to all of the remaining asbestos-containing products and the import and supply of anything containing chrysotile fibres, white asbestos, which is where we get our pre- and post-2000 cut-off dates from. Generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, if a building was built prior to the year 2000, there is a possibility that it may contain an asbestos material. Post 2000, it shouldn't do. However, unfortunately, we do get asbestos materials that crop up after that date. Supplies of things in tubs sitting around in dark storerooms may crop up and have been used in buildings after that date. We also have issues where countries that we import building materials and products from may not have the same regulation that we do surrounding asbestos use, and actually some of the products that they are advertising as non-asbestos containing actually do contain sometimes up to 10% asbestos content. So that's another issue that we struggle with a little bit in the industry. So in terms of asbestos locations, places you're likely to find it in a residential property, this is a drawing put together by the Health and Safety Executive. If you need to find this drawing and this list that goes with the drawing, feel free to Google Health and Safety Executive asbestos locations. There are a few different iterations of this drawing. Some companies, I think, have had a go at labelling their own ACMs to it, which I think is fair enough because the version that I'm aware of doesn't really cover some of the more common asbestos materials, so I've added them onto the bottom of this list. I won't go through this entire list. Feel free to have a look at this in your own time. It's not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. Unfortunately, the nature of asbestos, if you walk into a house, pretty much any single surface that you can see could realistically be made of an asbestos material or be concealing some asbestos directly behind it. So, you could make this list 2 times as long, 3 times as long, frankly, but some of the more common ones that I've added on that aren't on this list are asbestos cement flue pipes, which I find are very common right the way up until 1999. A lot of boilers, Worcester, Bosch, freestanding boilers, and Ideal Mexico or Concord boilers were installed with asbestos cement flue pipes, as far as I can tell in my experience, right up until that prohibition date. So a very common one to find. The same with undercloak boards to roof verges. I would probably argue one of the most common asbestos materials that I come across in the UK. If there's a house with a gable roof on it, there is a significant chance that roof verge has been undercloaked with an asbestos cement board, if it hasn't been replaced in the last 20 years or is a more sort of traditional roof with like a slate undercloak or something like that. Bitumen damp proof courses as well, very very common. It's less common that they contain asbestos, but the bitumen course itself is very common, and one that I'll sample on every property that I go to. Asbestos cement soil vent pipes, very common from sort of 1930s, and very, very common in post-war non-traditional build housing. A lot of the Cornish units that are present in my geographical patch have asbestos cement soil stacks running up through them. And then where those soil pipes are boxed in within the property, very often they can be asbestos insulating board or also cement board as well. The AIB much more common in sort of late 60s, 1970s houses, I tend to find. One that's a little bit less common but crops up every now and then, the little telephone insulator caps that you get where telephone wires come into the property, usually at sort of eaves level. If they are like a Bakelite type material, more often than not they will also contain asbestos fibres. So yeah, just a fun little one for you to keep your eyes peeled for. So the main reason that we are here today, this evening, is to talk about asbestos textured coatings. You'll also hear them referred to as Artex as well, and I will get onto that in a second, the reason for that. So decorative textured coatings they're plaster-based applications, and when I say that, don't think that all of this applies to all plaster in the UK. Generally speaking, these are the only, well, not the only, but the most common plaster-based applications that contain asbestos in the UK. It's very, very unlikely that you'll find sort of gypsum or lime-based plaster that contains asbestos as an added product in the UK. We're quite fortunate in that regard. It's usually found as a wall or a ceiling finish in domestic properties, but obviously you'll find it in commercial and industrial units as well. So the reason that we're concerned about it is that in the 20th century, asbestos was added to the material. So it was usually delivered to site in a powdered form and then mixed with water, sometimes hot water, sometimes cold. There are theories about that asbestos was only ever added to hot mixed textured coating. Unfortunately, I've never met anyone that artexed with asbestos Artex that can confirm or deny that rumor. But if there's anyone in the chat that has experience of that, please feel free to share. So like I say, it was added into the material, quite often mixed on site, and usually was in concentrations of sort of 3 to 5% asbestos, but sometimes less than that. The addition of asbestos fibres to Artex or texture coating products was prohibited in 1992. So not either of the two cut-off dates that I referred to earlier, but kind of in the middle there. That doesn't necessarily mean that you'll never find asbestos containing Artex in a house built in 1993. It means it should be less likely, but obviously, like I said before, these materials do have a tendency to unfortunately hang around and emerge and be used after that cut-off date. But if you have asbestos if you have texture coating in a property built in the 90s, I would still advise that you have it tested just to be on the safe side. I believe the latest constructed property I have found asbestos texture coating in was built in 1994, though I know of anecdotal evidence of many other surveyors who found it right the way up to the year 2000 and possibly even beyond that as well, though those are few and far between. So how bad really is Artex? In reality, it poses a negligible risk, verging on zero risk. When it's in good condition and it's still attached to the ceiling, it will not be readily shedding asbestos fibres. So I like to refer to it as a kind of a current risk or a potential risk. So long as the texture coating is present, there is always a potential risk, and that risk increases when the coating degrades or it's actively damaged. So that is, for example, we're talking about scraping the nibs off of the texture if you're preparing to skim it with plaster, for example, or if you've got a water leak that's come through from the roof and it delaminates the texture coating and that's fixed to the plasterboard, and that texture coating falls to the floor. Those are the higher risk situations. And again, like I say, we're talking about 3 to 5% concentrations of asbestos fibres here. So it's not going to be the same as if you disturbed an asbestos insulating board, for example, which usually has sort of percentages between 15-25% up to 40% asbestos content. But like I said before, the aim of the game here is to be avoiding all exposure to all types of asbestos fibers, regardless of the concentration. So obviously, you can scale down the risk to a certain degree, but I would still be stressing that it's something that ultimately people will probably want to be rid of in the long run. So why do we have these different names for them? We've got Artex and textured coatings, and you'll hear various different names referred to it. That tends to come from the trade names of the products that were used at the time. Artex was the most common one in the UK, but you had Shortex and Pebble Coat and many other trade names as well. Artex just seems to be the one that stuck, in the same way that Hoover applies to vacuum cleaners and that sort of thing. So a lot of people believe that the name Artex actually comes from a contraction of asbestos reinforced texture, although very believable, because that's generally the reason that asbestos was added to these materials. It is a bit of an urban myth, and Artex, the company themselves, confirmed that it means artistic texture. It might be quite a divisive opinion, that one, but it's the one that they went with, so we'll go along with that as well. You'll probably have seen many of these patterns applied to Artex ceilings. If you've got the full house, please feel free to shout that out in the chat. I think I'm most of the way there. There may be one or two of these that I've not encountered yet. They're a little bit more unusual, but the general ones that you tend to see are the swirls and the stipples. I'd say, generally speaking, and obviously, none of this can be seen by the naked eye, but the swirls and the stipples are quite often asbestos containing, and obviously that will be to do with the fashions at the time when asbestos was being added to these materials. I see the scroll quite often in sort of 90s built properties, which in my mind tends to mean that it's less likely to contain asbestos if it was added around that time. However, I've also had some positive results from that as well. And the knived plaster I tend to see in a lot of kind of traditional sort of Tudor style pubs and the houses and things like that as well. The photograph on the right is an asbestos textured coating applied to a wall. This is in a flat. This was the same in every flat in the block. Some of you may be very familiar with this texture. It's quite a gnarly one. It's very strong. It's probably grazed a few elbows in its time, and it's not particularly nice stuff to look at. So again, you clients may be wanting to know how they can be rid of it. So I'll give you some advice on that in a second. But first, if you come across a texture coating, first thing you need to do is have it tested. Like I say, not all textured coatings are asbestos containing. So you should have a qualified asbestos surveyor take samples. That's my biased opinion, obviously, being a qualified asbestos surveyor. I will talk about DIYing it as well, but I'll tell you why, in my opinion, DIYing is not an advisable course of action. I say qualified asbestos surveyor. I've not said UCAS accredited asbestos surveyor. The reason for that is there are many highly competent asbestos surveyors that don't operate under a UCAS accreditation banner, and vice versa. There are some individuals who operate under a UCAS accredited company who may not necessarily be the most competent or qualified person for the task. To take samples in the UK, you don't need to be UCAS accredited. To analyse the samples for asbestos, you do. But in terms of just getting someone to the site to take a sample, like I say, I'd recommend a professional. The main reason for this is because they're going to be minimising the risk of contamination of the property. Unfortunately, by its nature, textured coating is a nasty sample to take. Sometimes not all of it goes in the bag. If it's usually the positive stuff, like I say, is quite hardy and puts up quite a fight in terms of sampling. If you're doing this on your own, there's a possibility that you're going to be spraying flakes of that all over your property, into your carpet, which obviously comes with a risk of then making the asbestos fibres airborne. So another reason that I would recommend you get a professional to take a sample is that they should therefore be taking enough of a sample to get an accurate result. And the reason that I say that is because, like I mentioned before, the concentrations of textured coating, the asbestos fibres within, is very low. It's very easy to get a false negative result on a textured coating sample if you haven't taken enough of the material within the sample. So I've got a little graphic from the analyst guide, which shows you the guidance on how to take a texture coating sample in a second. So I'll show you that, but essentially there's a certain amount of the material that you need to take in order to actually, for the analyst who's analysing the sample to be able to find asbestos fibres within it. The other sort of most important thing that a qualified asbestos surveyor will be doing is they'll be checking the material that the Artex has been adhered to. Like I say, most of the time it's going to be plasterboard or maybe a concrete soffit if you're working in a block of flats. It may also be an old lath and plaster ceiling, but very occasionally Artex has been applied to asbestos insulating board or cement ceilings. And I would argue that if that were the case, then the larger risk that you have on your hands is the actual substrate material above the Artex. But, generally speaking, only a qualified asbestos surveyor will be able to tell you that is the case. But that said, if you are going to be DIYing it, there are test kits that you can order online. They're about £20 per sample. I've seen some on Amazon. However, they don't provide you with any PPE or RPE. Essentially, if you order that test kit, you'll be sent a couple of plastic Ziploc bags and a free post envelope to send that into a UCAS accredited bulk analysis laboratory, which is, the laboratory I'm sure will be perfectly legitimate, and you'll get a sample certificate confirming whether asbestos has been found or not in the sample that was provided. However, if you're just, if you're just spending that £20, you're obviously not protecting yourself with suitable respiratory protective equipment, and you might not necessarily be protecting the environment around you by using polythene drop sheets or containing the material in any way when you're taking the sample. So it's things like that I don't want to scare away homeowners, because obviously not everyone has the budget for getting qualified asbestos surveyors out to a property, but I do just suggest to people that they really look into what the requirements are to take the samples safely. And like I say, there is also a risk if you're taking a texture coating sample of your own. You might just knock 2 stipples into a bag and send that in. I can almost guarantee you that will probably return negative 95% of the time. We take quite large samples of texture coating. Like I say, I'll show you how much in a second. And if you are doing it on your own, there is a risk that you're not going to be taking a large enough sample, which is why I don't advise it for a non-homogeneous material like texture coating. If you're taking a corner off of your profiled cement roof sheets on your garage, if you take a corner, like a centimetre corner off of that roof sheet, there's a good chance that that's going to come back positive if it is a positive material. But that rule does not apply for texture coatings due to the sort of low concentrations of asbestos we're talking about. I've also mentioned here that many UCAS accredited asbestos labs take walk-ins or pre-booked samples. At CASA, we do that. We've got a lab in Keynsham, just outside of Bristol. If you have any samples that you've come across, in your personal or work life, you need them analysed by a UCAS accredited laboratory, feel free to come and talk to us. Come and ring the buzzer. I've got, like I say, contact details at the end, so feel free to get in touch. So what are the options? These are the things that you can be advising your client of if they've encountered textured coatings, or if you've encountered textured coatings in the properties that you're surveying on behalf of your client. Like I say, first thing you want to do is have it tested. All of these are kind of irrelevant if the texture coating is negative. Ultimately, they can pretty much do whatever they want to do with it, obviously bearing in mind the other hazards that building materials present, silica silica dust release, that kind of thing. So if it's in good condition, you can leave texture coating as it is. If it's been skimmed, again, you can leave it as it is. So long as you're satisfied that you have that potential risk still remaining of damage from accidental disturbances. Say you get an electrician in who's not aware that that material is there, and they're coring big holes through the ceiling. Obviously, there's a risk that they are then going to be disturbing that asbestos material. If the material is not particularly in good condition, I would recommend that you encapsulate it. You can just use regular decorator's paint for this, your sort of standard Duluxes and things like that. It's probably a bit overkill, but in the asbestos removal industry, we use a product called ET150 or similar. There are many other trade names for it as well, which is a very thick asbestos encapsulant paint. It's plastic based, so it's not going to be appropriate for your traditional properties, but they are working on breathable encapsulant paints for asbestos materials as well. I haven't personally tested any of them, so I can't guarantee their suitability for your period properties, but that's the sort of thing that I would recommend having a good talk with some asbestos consultants about. You've also got the options for skimming or overboarding them, and I'll go over those on the next couple of slides. And if it is required, then you also have the option to remove the texture coatings in their entirety. So this is the guidance that I was referring to. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can kind of skim read it. And like I say, this is available in some documentation, which I will cover in a little list at the end of this presentation. But just generally, you need to collect 20 centimeters squared of texture coating for each sample, which is quite a sizable chunk out of a ceiling finish. Not always people are happy that we are taking these sort of samples out of their ceilings, and sometimes you might need to patch up sample points afterwards if you're willing to keep the texture coating after the sampling process. So in terms of asbestos removals, I'm just going to cover the 3 different categories of asbestos removals in the UK, and then I will tell you how they relate to the removal of texture coating specifically. And it's kind of quite important that you are aware of the differences between the different categories, because you'll hear them referred to quite often in terms of asbestos removals. They also kind of almost directly correlate with cost and risk and time involved in asbestos removals as well. So starting with the highest cost generally and highest risk, and usually the longest asbestos removal process, are licensed removals. So these will apply to licensable materials, which are the 3 listed there. So if you have thermal or sprayed insulation, or insulating board that contains asbestos fibers, like I say, regardless of the fiber type or color, if any of those materials contain asbestos fibers, then they are licensable materials. And generally speaking, and like I've said here, there are some exceptions to this rule. They will require a license to remove them, granted by the HSE. So you have licensed asbestos removal contractors. That will require a full enclosure to be constructed in order to remove those materials. Luckily, with texture coating, that does not apply, but it's just important that you know that that's kind of the one end of the spectrum, because then in the middle you have notifiable non-licensed work. I'll come back to that one in a second, because I'm first going to explain what non-licensed work is. So non-licensed work applies to all of the materials that are not listed in the licensed category. So we're talking about texture coatings, we're talking about thermoplastic or vinyl floor tiles, bitumen materials that contain asbestos, bakelite materials that contain asbestos. So I've got, there you go. So I've got some checkered asbestos floor tiles there. You've got a bakelite, like a reinforced composite toilet cistern. Very common to come across those in old schools. There's still a fair few of them kicking around. If you've got ex-local authority properties, you may still find those in the little outhouse toilets next to the sheds in the garden. And then at that bottom picture there, you've got an asbestos cement flue pipe. So they're generally considered to be lower risk asbestos materials, so they won't, generally speaking, require a full enclosure to remove. When I talk about enclosures, I'm talking about the big polythene tents. Probably often get confused with like the sort of pest control fumigation tents. The enclosures will require the operatives to be going in like the full face powered respiratory equipment with protective coveralls, and they have to adhere to many rules in order to remove the asbestos safely. That's generally not required for non-licensed materials. But the contractors that are doing that work do still need to tick certain boxes in terms of having appropriate insurance for working with asbestos, competency, the right equipment. They should be taking the right precautions, and they should also have put together a satisfactory risk assessment and method statement for the work as well. So it's not as policed as licensed work, because generally, if you are doing licensed asbestos removals, you are on the radar of the Health and Safety Executive. Unfortunately, the Health and Safety Executive have limited powers to do much about non-licensed asbestos removal works that happens on a day-to-day basis. And that's just because, a lot of your day-to-day builders have the ability to do non-licensed asbestos removal works. Some of them will tell you that they have the ability to do it, but don't necessarily have the paperwork or the actual equipment or precautions to back that up. But again, that's something that I can get into at a later date. You've also then got this category in the middle then, which is notifiable non-licensed. So that applies to non-licensed asbestos materials, but under certain circumstances, it may require notification to the HSE prior to removal. So that generally applies to non-licensed materials that are already a higher risk, and that may be because they are significantly damaged. So we're talking about fire damaged asbestos cement roofs to warehouses, or it may also apply to materials where they are in large quantities as well. So quite often, if you are removing Artex from every single room in a house, that will be defined as a large amount, and that will become notifiable non-licensed work. So more often than not, the removal contractor will choose to notify that to the HSE. I say more often than not. I'm sure there are many occasions where that doesn't happen. But if you're working with a licensed removal contractor, they will probably opt to notify the HSE about that work prior to them starting. And essentially all that does is it puts them on the radar of the HSE, which means that the Health and Safety Executive are, they're so likely to, they have the potential to drop in during the removal work just to check in and make sure that everything's being done safely. So if your contractor is willing to notify to the HSE to remove Artex, it means that they're probably going to be doing a very good job, because they have nothing to hide and they are quite happy for the HSE to drop in on them and say hello. In reality, I think 80% of the time, contractors will not notify for removal of Artex because it is a very low risk product. And so generally small amounts of Artex removal, so say just to a single room or part of a ceiling, will not be notified to the HSE and will just be removed, hopefully following all of the precautions that are required anyway. So in terms of removal or ongoing management, you've got a few different options, like I've mentioned earlier. So skimming and overboarding. A lot of plasterers will offer to plaster skim over textured coatings, and there's a few different ways of doing this that I've seen, and obviously I'm not a plasterer, so if anyone has any experience of plastering over Artex, I'm always happy to hear your experience of it. my experience of it, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. Some plasterers will scrape back the texture coating ceiling before they skim over it to remove the nibs, and it means that they can apply a thinner skim to the surface, so that they don't have to be skimming over the nibs as well, which obviously will sit proud of the ceiling surface. Obviously, if you are scraping back the texture coating, you are actively disturbing it. It's probably one of the worst things that you could do to Artex, bar, taking an electric sander to it. Some plasterers, unfortunately, are not concerned about the asbestos content of texture coatings, and they will do this in people's properties, regardless of whether the client is concerned. So it's worth having these conversations with your plasterer, and you may wish to opt for a different contractor if they are showing, no concern whatsoever. In my experience, plastering, skimming over the Artex usually involves keying into it, or, like I say, scraping off the nibs, usually in an uncontrolled manner. They will just go on the floor. If you're lucky, the plasterers put a dust sheet across the carpet, but still, those asbestos fibres will be in the air, and unless they are operating a negative pressure unit and a partial enclosure, those asbestos fibres are not going to disappear overnight. And again, keying into the surface to get a good key for the plaster to stick into will also be actively disturbing the material as well. I often recommend that you have an asbestos removal contractor deal with the ceiling before a plasterer goes near it. Like I say, the plasterer may have the appropriate insurance and paperwork to be able to deal with the asbestos themselves. I think in reality, that's not always the case, unfortunately. So if you've got a solid concrete soffit, you can have a removal contractor scrape the ceilings back. But if you have plasterboard, they don't tend to like scraping the ceilings. And the main reason for that is because, you're not going to be able to take much of the textured coating off without just digging into the plasterboard itself and, absolutely damaging the boards. So usually removal contractors will opt to pull down plasterboard ceilings. Like I say, it can't really effectively be scraped. So what they would do is they would sheet out the area with polythene. So in the picture there, it's a little bit small, I'm afraid, but you can see the outcome of a plasterboard pull down. I've got a larger view of that photograph on the next slide. They'll sheet out the area with polythene. They should be spraying down the ceilings to suppress any fibre release, and then they'll be carefully dropping the plasterboard ceilings down. Unfortunately, it is still quite dusty work because, as I'm sure most of us are aware, dust and junk will gather on the tops of those ceiling boards over the years when heating installers are taking up the floorboards in the room above and installing pipework and things like that. It's rarely a clean job. If you've got multiple rooms where you're stripping Artex ceilings all at the same time, then they may be putting it under a partial enclosure, which will involve an airlock on the front essentially, and a negative pressure unit to draw the air out of the enclosure and push it through a filtration device. I've also just sort of mentioned overboarding there. It's a similar problem in that usually you will have to directly disturb the asbestos material by fixing battens into the ceiling to then board over the top of it. So again, it's not an ideal one. It would arguably be less of a fibre release than if you're scraping the entire ceiling or keying into it. And again, it can be done in a controlled fashion, so that's also an option. But it's ultimately a case of having a conversation with the contractor and seeing how they would be going about doing this. Again, DIY, it's an option. The domestic properties are not covered by the control of asbestos regs, so arguably homeowners are entitled to do, unfortunately, whatever they like with asbestos materials in their own homes. They are not at the mercy of any sort of legislation like that. Landlords are covered by, to a certain degree, the control of asbestos regs, but that only applies to communal areas within domestic properties, so hallways and things like that. However, they do have duties of care under various other, landlord regulations. But I do present this as an option to homeowners when I'm doing surveys for them. And, if they are showing a sort of a higher risk appetite, or potentially they might be a tradesperson. They might have quite good experience with working in properties, that kind of thing. There is the potential for them to do a certain amount of asbestos removals themselves. So the HSE has accounted for this. They have a section of their website called HSE Asbestos Essentials. I highly recommend bookmarking it, because it's really useful information just to see how asbestos removals should be done. It won't be quite as comprehensive as if you get professionals in to do it. But generally speaking, all of the equipment that they list and the procedures that they list in the task sheets on that website will be very similar to what a professional asbestos removal contractor would do. So sometimes I show clients these task sheets and I say, look, if you're expressing an interest in wanting to do it yourself, here is how the HSE says that you should do it. And quite often just the amount of equipment that is required and the procedures that are involved tends to put people off, because I think a lot of people think they can just chuck a dust mask on and just get on with it, which again, like I say, I have no doubt happens an awful lot of the time. But when you're following the task sheets, you'll see that it should be done a lot more carefully than that. If they're still serious about doing it, then the equipment that's required to do it in those task sheets can usually be hired or purchased from a few different companies around the country. Some of the main ones are Beacon, SMH Products, and Empire. There are a few other ones as well, but those are the ones that I tend to encounter in the asbestos industry. So they provide all of these materials and consumables to the asbestos industry, but they do also provide to the public as well. So it's worth being aware of those. They will also, if they're going to be doing it themselves, need to be aware of an asbestos waste collection service. They are not the same as asbestos removal contractors generally. They are usually just companies that have a permit from the Environment Agency to transport hazardous waste, which will usually include asbestos waste as well. So some of the larger companies are like Windsor, but there are also some sort of regional companies as well. Moreland Environmental operates in my neck of the woods, that kind of company as well. So essentially all they will be able to do is collect asbestos waste that has already been safely double bagged from a property. They will not come in and take any plasterboard ceilings down or anything like that, but they will provide you with a consignment note to evidence that they are going to be taking the asbestos waste to a legal waste processing centre, and then obviously you are then reducing the risk of that asbestos waste being fly tipped, which unfortunately is a very common problem in the UK. Some household waste and recycling centres also have the ability to deal with small amounts of asbestos waste. Some of them will take more but will charge you per bag that you bring. They will only allow you to bring bonded asbestos materials, they usually refer to them as, which is kind of your lower risk stuff, Artex, cement products, floor tiles, that kind of thing. They will not allow you to bring licensable asbestos materials because there's a good chance that if you're doing your own licensed asbestos removal works at home, you're probably not going to be doing it safely. So yeah, just to finish off on texture coating then, so these are a couple of photos of the result of texture coating removals. So clues kind of in the name. With a plasterboard pull down, unfortunately the plasterboard has to go. It's impossible to separate Artex from the plasterboard itself. This would obviously apply to a lath and plaster ceiling as well, although if you're lucky the laths might be left in situ for you to plaster over again afterwards. All of the ceiling has to go and will be removed as asbestos waste, which leaves you with a blank canvas that you then obviously need to factor in the costs of a new ceiling being installed. But it gives you the opportunity to sort out any wiring or have a good look at your floor joists and things like that. With a concrete scrape, it's a tricky one, this, because again it's nigh on impossible to get an actual clean asbestos free surface. What you can do is you can scrape it right the way back to the extent that the material that is left poses a negligible risk, and you can then just skim over the top of that as your next step. Again, it's just a case of being aware that it's there, but realistically, if you were to disturb any of that material that's left, the fiber release off of it would be very, very insignificant. Not zero, but insignificant. Like I say, it's all to do with the relative intensity and frequency of exposures that do lead to asbestos-related diseases. So essentially, you're just reducing the risk to as low as practicably possible. I will leave you with a list of relevant legislation and some further reading. Obviously, most of you will have heard of this little ditty, the Health and Safety at Work Act. Most of the asbestos regulations are a subsidiary of this of this Act of Parliament. So just for some context, maybe for the students, this is where most of it stems from. So most of my work, I'm operating under the control of asbestos regulations. So I am ensuring that clients and removal contractors and building contractors are adhering to these regulations. But like I say, they do not by default apply to a standard privately owned domestic property. So although they can be taken as best practice in those circumstances, they are not legally enforceable, unless of course it is a contractor that is doing work on behalf of a client in those properties, in which case they will be covered under the regulations, under one of the regulations that, oh God, the number has literally just escaped me, but it's essentially the duty to be aware of asbestos materials in any workplace. When you have a contractor that comes into your own home to do work for you, that place then becomes their workplace, and so they are obliged to be aware of asbestos materials in that workplace. So they may ask the homeowner if they've had an asbestos survey done. If they haven't, they may request that one is done before they start work. That's what they should be doing. They may also offer to get an asbestos survey done and include the price of that in their price for the works. That tends to be what I notice, the sort of medium to medium-ish enterprises. They will tend to be quite on top of that. Quite a few of our clients are sort of medium-sized building firms in the local area who are very aware of their duty under these regulations. Same with construction design and management regulations. It's a similar requirement to be aware of any asbestos materials or other hazardous materials present before you start work. And they will come to us and get an asbestos survey done before they start work in someone's property. The RICS asbestos practice note. I've read through this quite a few times and I really like it. I think it's a good introduction to asbestos materials. It's a good refresher for some of the more experienced surveyors as well. It will cover a lot of what I've covered sort of at the beginning of this presentation as well, but in more detail. So it's a very good starting place, especially for the students in the chat. It's a freely available document, I believe, last time I checked. So you should just be able to Google it and find it on the RICS website, and like I say, I would start from there. There's some other very asbestos specific documents. So the L143, managing and working with asbestos, is what is known as an ACOP in the industry. So it's an approved code of practice, and it's the ACOP for the control of asbestos regulations. So CAR 2012 is written in legalese. It's not particularly easy to understand for the layperson. I don't tend to refer to it directly too often because it's not massively detailed. It tends to generalize and things like that. The ACOP takes each of the regulations and breaks them down into sort of sub-points about how best to implement your work to meet those regulations. The next sort of level of guidance down from that are the HSG guidance documents. So those are written by the Health and Safety Executive. The two main ones that we focus on, sort of on the surveying and management side, are 264 and 248. So that's the survey guide and the analyst's guide respectively. The analyst guide was updated last year, so is very up to date. The survey guide was last updated in 2012. But obviously we haven't had new regulations since then, so generally speaking they're both as up to date as they possibly can be, although we may find that some of the survey guide, generally speaking in the industry, they're not always the best practices compared to some of the stuff that we've adopted since then. INDG 223 is a smaller document that's kind of more relevant to if you are a premises owner. It's useful to managing asbestos within your building. So again, that will be another good starting point in terms of identifying asbestos within your building, how you go about doing that, who you should talk to, and then what to do when asbestos is or if it's discovered in that building. A few more regs. The REACH regulations, or now UK REACH, post-Brexit, they are the current regulations that essentially make asbestos illegal in this country. So obviously I mentioned those two prohibition dates, 1985 and 1999. There were a few other prohibition dates around that sort of time as well, 1992 I've touched upon. The most recent regs that basically just say asbestos is still very much illegal in the UK are REACH. So I wouldn't recommend delving into those too much, but it's just worth being aware that that's why it's still prohibited in the UK. Hazardous waste regs apply to the carriage of hazardous waste, obviously clues in the name, which is what asbestos waste is covered under. So whenever you are dealing with contractors who have permits from the Environment Agency, everything that they're doing should be under the hazardous waste regs 2005. And then we also have the asbestos licensing regs 1983 amended 98, which applies to the licensing by the HSE to or of asbestos removal contractors. So again, that's kind of the regulations that they abide by in terms of their licensing requirements. In terms of recommendations for your clients, these are just sort of general recommendations. Obviously I've kind of covered what to do if you discover texture coating, but just generally I would say apply these to your surveys. Include them as little points in your survey reports. If you've surveyed a pre-2000 property, you should be instructing an asbestos management survey. It doesn't matter if it was refurbished last year. Refurbishment does not always mean that asbestos has been removed. More often than not, I actually tend to find it just means it's been covered up. An asbestos management survey will flag some of that. However, if they've done a very good job of covering it up, that is a non-intrusive survey. So, we're not going to be putting holes in walls and things like that on that kind of survey. If your client has got refurbishment work planned, then I would recommend that you have a refurbishment survey conducted. Or a demolition survey conducted if they're planning on knocking down parts of the building. These are obviously by nature more intrusive surveys, and they will require us to lift windowsills, tear up floor finishes, may even lift floorboards, put holes in walls, that kind of thing. Open up boxings in bathrooms, things like that. So although we will be as tidy as we possibly can, and obviously we will, endeavour to meet clients' expectations on site, unfortunately you should expect some potentially irreparable damage to happen. So it's always worth discussing this with your asbestos surveyor before they carry out the survey. Make sure that they leave anything untouched that you're not going to be doing as part of the work that you have proposed in the property, but anything that is likely to be disturbed by removal contractors, essentially we will disturb it in a controlled fashion, in a small scale, so that they don't disturb it in an uncontrolled fashion on a larger scale. So if any suspect ACMs are identified on your home surveys, so like I say, texture coatings are a given. Some of you will be identifying suspect soffit boards, cement or AIB, old floor tiles under carpets, that kind of thing. I would advise for them to be sampled by a qualified asbestos surveyor and then analysed by a UCAS accredited laboratory. Some companies, like my own, will do both. So we will send a surveyor out to the property. That surveyor will then take those samples back to the lab, and you'll have a sampling report, with your asbestos presence or not presence detected, essentially. You can also then conduct a full-scale survey which will cover all available surfaces in the property. I think that you should be reassuring your clients that the risk of poor condition asbestos in domestic properties is quite rare. It's very rare in all of the surveys that I do on a day-to-day basis that I ever have the need to put on my RPE just to walk into a room, like a living room or anything like that. I usually am just putting RPE on for, intrusive work and actual sort of checking the materials of the that the building is made of, and obviously sampling as well. But generally speaking, it's very, very rare that and obviously going in loft spaces as well, but it's very rare that I come across something in a cupboard that makes me need to step away and put a mask and a coverall on. So in reality, the risk of that is low. If the client wishes, they can have air monitoring conducted. So that will provide them with evidence of airborne fibre levels just during normal occupation if they so choose. But more commonly, we do it following asbestos removal work. And air monitoring is something that I can talk about in depth another time. But if you've got any sort of burning questions about it, feel free to put them in the chat and I will cover them very soon. So, questions then. Marion, I don't know if you'd like to step back in before I talk too much.
Yeah, well, I was actually just mindful of time, Callum, because it's we've gone over a little bit, and I'm sorry to say my kids are starving. But as I'm looking through, there are some questions, but some of them have been answered as you've gone through. So what I'll do, if it's okay with everybody, firstly, thank you so much for doing this session. It's been brilliant. I think everybody will have got something from that. What we'll do is we'll take the questions that you've got here, and Callum, perhaps if you and I can compare notes, etc., and maybe we can pop them in the hub.
Yep.
As some answers, and I'll get this uploaded. I know there are a few people who struggle to get on and whatnot, so I'll get it uploaded as quickly as I can. But thank you ever so much. That was really, really useful. Lots of thank yous in here. So thanks ever so much for your time, and everybody, I will see you all again soon. Thanks a lot, Callum. Bye.
Thank you, Marion.
Bye, everyone.